All right. Good morning. It's Saturday here in Brooklyn, and I'm just going to read the news. I figured as I go through it, I might as well just try to read it out loud. Could be boring, but we'll see. Hope you're doing good today. All right. So I'm going to jump in, and let's see what we'll start up with. Guardian's got an article, How Science Finally Caught Up with Trump's Playbook with Millions of Lives at Stake. It's from April 4th, 2020. From The Guardian, on March 6th, a group of epidemiologists at Imperial College London gave the White House Coronavirus Task Force a heads up about the terrifying projections from the disease they're about to publish relating to the US. The Imperial scientists' findings would have induced paralytic fear in all but the most nonchalant American. They likened COVID-19, which by that point had already extended its tentacles into at least 28 states in the United States, to the 1918 influenza pandemic that killed 50 million people around the globe. On the basis of their modeling, they calculated that if nothing was done to halt the spread of the disease, within weeks it would infect 81% of the US population. The virus would ravage the nation, eviscerate its health system, and, here's the sting, put 2.2 million Americans in body bags. We don't know at what point that bone-chilling figure was presented to Donald Trump. What we do know is that on the same day, the 6th of March, the President of the United States was taking a tour of the Atlanta offices of the Federal Disease Control Agencies, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, also known as the CDC, as we all know. Trump was in an ebullient mood. He had just heard on Fox News that the latest tally of coronavirus cases in the country was 240 with 11 deaths. Trump and his favorite TV channel were as one in their interpretation of these figures. Things were going great, and there wasn't really anything to worry about. In the end, Trump told reporters trailing him, people have to remain calm. All Trump said is, be calm. Then a resourceful reporter asked Trump to set out the Trump administration's latest forecast for how coronavirus would progress in the country. Trump replied, we don't have a forecast because we don't know. Trump's answer was one of the few candid moments over the past 3 months of his handling of the coronavirus crisis. It is true they didn't know, that in a real sense they were walking blind. Already by March 6th, the absence of effective diagnostic testing, caused in part by the CDC's botched rollout of its own COVID-19 test, was severely hampering efforts to track the spread of the disease in the hope of containing it before overwhelming the country. Anybody that needs a test, Trump told the gaggle of reporters in Atlanta, Trump said they have the tests, and the tests are beautiful. Well, the tests were not beautiful, they were critically flawed. Anybody who needed a test was not getting them. With virtually no testing available to inform public conversation, Trump was free to unleash his natural ability on the problem, which he did with abandon throughout the early weeks of the crisis. Trump took to describing himself as a wartime president with COVID-19 as the enemy. But his dogged pursuit of his own instincts, his preference for letting his hunches lead the nation into battle rather than deploying the weaponry of evidence and science, has been the hallmark of his response to the contagion so far. From the first confirmed U.S. case in Washington state on the 20th of January to Trump's citing of Imperial's 22 million projected deaths, which he did for the first time just this week, he has kept up a relentlessly upbeat facade, downplaying the severity of the threat largely for the benefit of the New York Stock Exchange. Ooh. Trump said, we have it totally under control 2 days after that first confirmed case and a day before China cut off Wuhan, the city of 11 million. We only have 5 people. We pretty much shut it down coming from China, Trump said on the 30th of January, the day the World Health Organization declared a global emergency. It's going to disappear. One day, like a miracle, it will disappear, Trump said on the 27th of February, the day America mourned its first coronavirus death. Chinese commuters wore protective masks at home. Now, on Tuesday, Trump finally switched the tone. The country is in for a very painful 2 weeks, he said, and every American had to be prepared for the hard days that lie ahead. But the bitter truth could no longer be avoided. With stringent social distancing, the Imperial's 2.2 million body bags could be reduced, but by the reckoning even of Trump's own advisors, between 100 and 240,000 Americans are still likely to die. Trump now has on his watch a public health disaster of devastating proportions. Some 245,000 cases have been confirmed across the states, twice the number in Italy, the second highest nation in the Johns Hopkins league table. More than 6,000 people have died, and the curve is still rising exponentially. COVID-19 is overwhelming hospitals in New York, New Orleans, Detroit, and is hurtling towards the Trump-supported heartlands. The federal stockpile of essential medical equipment is nearly empty. Ventilators and protective medical staff are running fatally low. Doctors are improvising masks to save their own lives out of plastic bags and rubber bands. Even diagnostic testing, the most critical hope for getting on top of the disease, remains hard to get because of shortages in swabs and vials, leaving emergency coordinators still 3 months into this crisis in the dark. Now, you can have the best system in the world, but if you give the virus an 8-week head start, it will eat you alive. Jeremy Kondik? It's a catastrophe that many scientists and public health emergency experts believe could have substantially been averted if only Trump had listened. This will be regarded as the worst public health care disaster in America in a century, said Eric Topol, professor of molecular medicine at Scripps Research in San Diego. The root cause of the disaster was the lack of readiness to understand where, how, and when the disease was spreading. Jeremy Kondik, who led the U.S. government's response to international disasters between 2013 and 2017, said that stark contrasts in outcomes between different countries in terms of illnesses and death have been determined not by COVID-19 itself, but by how seriously each government took the risk and how early they acted. On that score, we failed badly. You can have the best system in the world, but if you give the virus an 8-week head start, it's going to eat you alive. For Naomi Oreskes, a history of science professor at Harvard, the unfolding calamity is the fulfillment of her worst fears. When we first heard about coronavirus, I and several of my colleagues worried that Trump would not attend to scientific advice. This is a man who has exhibited a reckless disregard for scientific evidence over climate change. If he could do that, there's always the question of whether he would take seriously any science. Oreskes sees COVID-19 as Trump's ultimate challenge. Would he put the lives of hundreds of thousands of Americans first, or would he dig into the tried and tested Republican playbook of showing hostility to science and expertise? Okay, it's a little political. Reining in government intervention and prioritizing the money markets. This is a test of whether Trump's government would act. What we've seen is that for the people in power in this country, ideology beats even an imminent threat. Ouch. As the president fiddles, people are dying. Nancy Pelosi, the top Democrat in Congress, took the extraordinary step on Sunday of accusing Trump directly of costing American lives. His lessening of the severity of the crisis and the virus early on was deadly. Pelosi told CNN as there will be delays in delivering medical equipment to where it is needed. She said, as the president fiddles, people are dying. That's a tough accusation, even by the standards of these hyper-partisan times, but a growing number of scientists and health emergency experts are tentatively drawing the same conclusion. We now know there will be well over 100,000 deaths, Topol said. A vast majority of those will have been unnecessarily lost because of the lack of preparedness of the United States. As a leader, Trump has to accept responsibility, which of course he won't. It's not as though Trump wasn't warned. In the wake of the Ebola epidemic in 2014, the Obama administration was so fearful of the dangers of another epidemic that they put in place several innovations designed to prepare the nation for a pandemic. Kondik, who was central to the Ebola response, has watched aghast as every element of that effort has been unpicked or overlooked by the Trump administration. Kondik said, we set up a special team for pandemic preparedness at the National Security Council. Trump dismantled that. We left them a very detailed playbook of the initial steps for managing an event just like this. They ignored that. When coronavirus reared its ugly head, there was plenty of early warning. Alex Azar, the Health and Human Services Secretary, became aware of the outbreak of a virus in China as early as the 3rd of January. By the 5th of January, scientists in Shanghai had obtained a complete viral genome from an infected patient and reported it immediately to GenBank, the genetic sequencing database of the United States National Institutes of Health, the NIH. By early February, scientists were aware that COVID-19 was both easily transmitted between individuals and had a high relative fatality rate, especially for older and vulnerable people. There was enough for scientists to know the virus had the potential to spread far and wide, and that urgent action was needed, Kondik said. At the same time, U.S. intelligence agencies were passing on their own warnings to the White House. According to the Washington Post, Azar tried several times to sound the alarm but couldn't get an audience with Trump until the 18th of January, at which point all the president wanted to talk about was vaping. The Post quoted an anonymous U.S. official who said the system was blinking red. The official said, Donald Trump may not have been expecting this, but a lot of people in the government were. They just couldn't get Trump to do anything about it. With the full might of the U.S. scientific community at his disposal, Trump appointed individuals not known for their prowess with pandemics in charge of the federal response. The coronavirus task force was to be led by the vice president, who has been widely criticized for his handling of a 2015 HIV outbreak when governor of Indiana. Trump is also increasingly relying on his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who made his first appearance at the task force briefing on Thursday. Politico has reported that Kushner, whose skill set is in real estate, has in turn reached out to his brother's father-in-law, who is a physician, for advice on fighting the pandemic. Trump's failure to heed the warnings and act quickly has set in train a domino effect that now imperils large swaths of the U.S. Again, his inability to get diagnostic testing going on a mass scale has developed into a sluggish mobilization of the federal government, a stuttering deployment of the Defense Production Act to enlist the firepower of corporations, and a stand-back, almost detached approach that has allowed state governors to take the lead in what Condit called the birth of a 50-state anarchy. One of the few proactive measures taken by Trump was to impose at least a partial travel ban on China and Europe. Scientists told Trump the move would only delay the advance of COVID-19 in the U.S. It could never stop it. Again, Trump didn't listen. Trump thought in terms of a wall. Put a wall around China and the virus won't come to the U.S. Trump was out of step with all the experts around him, Topol said. As a result, the United States lost the early potential to contain the virus, either by locking down hotspots as China did in the Hubei province, or through aggressive testing to isolate those infected as South Korea has done. Tomas Pueyo, a Stanford-trained consultant based in California, has laid out in sobering detail how quickly the disaster is laying waste to the U.S. His first exploration of the subject, a data-driven plea to take the disease seriously, posted on Medium in early March, received 40 million views. On Wednesday, Pueyo published his updated research. Shows America's curve of confirmed cases rising more steeply than any other country in the world. 3 weeks ago, Pueyo reminds us, the United States had fewer than 1,000 confirmed cases at a time when Trump was telling the world, no, I'm not concerned at all. No, I'm not. No, we've done a great job. Now, the America stands with 250,000 cases, and this is what exponential growth looks like. Having hit the Democratic-controlled high-density urban centers first, San Francisco and Seattle, then New York and New Jersey, now Detroit, the virus is marching inexorably in the direction of the more rural southern and heartland states that happen to form the crucible of Trump's base. Many of those states followed the lead set by Trump and Fox News, remaining relaxed about the threat and moving astonishingly slow to put physical distancing controls in place. Florida, under its Republican governor, Ron DeSantis, has echoed Trump's approach and only imposed a statewide stay-at-home order on Friday, despite having the sixth largest tally of confirmed cases in the country. Georgia and Mississippi followed suit. Some Republican states, including Oklahoma and South Carolina, still have no statewide mandatory stay-at-home orders. Pueyo points out that Republican voters are additionally vulnerable as they have a higher age profile than Democratic voters. Coronavirus makes no distinctions as to party, but it does prey on the elderly. So it is one of the great paradoxes of Trump's pandemic that may have put many of his own loyal supporters in moral peril. As Condit puts it, Trump has endangered his own supporters by sending out a message in contradiction to the science, and they believed him. That's that. That was The Guardian. You see what else? All right, Wired. We'll skip that one. That's about climate change. Let's try to stay on theme here. Why aren't the Swedes locked down? Why the Swedes aren't locked down? This is an article from The Economist, April 4th, 2020. While Sweden's fellow Scandinavians and nearly all other Europeans are stuck at home under orders from their governments, Swedes last weekend still enjoyed the springtime sitting in cafes and munching pickled herrings in restaurants. Swedish borders are open, as are cinemas, gyms, pubs, and schools for those under 16. Restrictions are minimal. The government recommends frequent hand washing for everybody, working from home for those who can, isolation for those who feel ill or who are older than 70. That includes King Gustav and his wife Silva, who are self-isolating in a castle. On March 29th, Sweden ban gatherings of more than 50 people. Britain has a similarly relaxed approach, at least until March 23rd, but then the government imposed the national lockdown. As the number of reported infections and deaths among the 10 million Swedes rose to 4,947 and 239 respectively as of March 31st, many predict that Sweden will soon follow the rest of Europe's example. Some fear Sweden has wasted precious time. Inherent in Sweden's social contract is trust in the state. Trust by the state in its citizens and trust among citizens, explains Lars Tragart, a historian. Swedes can be relied on to adhere to rules voluntarily and to self-regulate. Moreover, jokes Carl Bildt, a former prime minister, Swedes especially the older generation, have a genetic disposition to social distancing anyway. Over half of Swedish households consist of just one person, the highest number of single-person households in the entire world. Sweden is sparsely populated, and Swedes do not hug or kiss as much as the Southern Europeans tend to do. Business leaders have been more vocal in their opposition to a national lockdown than in other countries. Jacob Wallenberg, chairman of Investor and Investment Company, warned about social unrest, violence, dramatic unemployment, and great suffering if the COVID crisis goes on for long in an interview he had with Financial Times. Johan Trogerby, chief executive of SEB, a bank, worries about creating a banking crisis on top of an economic and health crisis. So far, the policy of Stefan Löfven, the prime minister, has been guided by the independent public health agency. Anders Tegnell, the agency chief epidemiologist, advised the government to let the virus spread as slowly as possible while sheltering the vulnerable until much of the population becomes naturally immune or vaccine becomes available. Yet some experts worry that Mr. Löfven is prioritizing the health of the economy over that of the public. A petition signed by more than 2,000 scientists and professors, including Carl Hendrik Helvin, the chairman of the Nobel Foundation, called on the government to introduce more stringent containment measures. It is too risky to let people decide how to behave, argues Joachim Rocklove, an epidemiologist at Umeå University. During other pandemics, such as the outbreak of cholera at the end of the 19th century or the AIDS pandemic in the 1980s, Sweden imposed more stringent restrictions than its neighbors. So far, the public is supportive of Mr. Löfven's contrarian strategy. But once the death toll rises quickly, this can change. And that was The Economist. This is nice because nobody's watching. It's great. All right. Ebola should have immunized the United States to the coronavirus. This is Foreign Affairs by Michael Kirchhoff from March 28th of 2020. In international crises, policymakers and politicians rarely have a dress rehearsal before their debut on the main stage. Yet in retrospect, the Ebola outbreak of 2013 to 2015 amounts to exactly that, a real-life test of Washington's ability to detect and contain an infectious disease that threatens global security. Precisely because those who fought the spread of Ebola virus knew exactly how close we came to global catastrophe, the National Security Council initiated a detailed study of the successes and failures of the international and domestic responses. Starting in February 2015, 26 departments and agencies across the U.S. government participated in a lesson learned process headed by the White House that produced a 73-page analysis with 21 findings and recommendations. The author led this effort under the stewardship of National Security Advisor Susan Rice and Ebola czar Ron Klein, and he authored the NSC report recently made public by the New York Times. It was clear to those who responded to the Ebola outbreak that the response system in the United States and the international response system would risk collapse if faced with a more dire scenario. It was equally clear that a more dire scenario taking place was a question of when, not if. As the NSC report concluded, future epidemics, especially those that are airborne and transmissible before symptoms appear, are plausibly far more dangerous. It continued, an appropriate minimum planning benchmark might be an epidemic an order of magnitude or two more difficult, with much more significant domestic spread. Although the cost of the current pandemic will not be fully measurable for some time, what was done and what will left undone in the nearly 4 years between the end of the Ebola crisis and the first appearance of COVID-19 is now in the public domain. It's all too clear how and when the United States failed to better prepare. The Ebola virus dominated headlines in the United States in the summer and fall of 2014 as it spread uncontrollably across West Africa. Thomas Duncan became the first infected person to die of the disease on U.S. soil. Ultimately, Ebola claimed the lives of over 11,000 people worldwide and 2 people in the United States. But those who participated in the response overwhelmingly came away with the view that it could have been exponentially worse. With Ebola, we got lucky twice over. The deadly hemorrhagic pathogen, filovirus, was not airborne, and the outbreak occurred in a remote region of the world with few linkages to population centers in Africa and with no direct air routes to global cities. We knew that we wouldn't get lucky twice again. With urbanization and deforestation driving together species that don't normally interact in wet markets selling wild animal meat across Africa and Asia, the world is developing in ways that significantly increase the likelihood that a zoonotic virus will jump from an animal host to a human. Biotech lab accidents, terrorists, and offensive bioweapon programs are also possible sources of mass infection. When a virus makes the jump for whatever reason, intercontinental air travel ensures that it spreads with spectacular speed. The response to Ebola exposed gaps in preparedness and capability in every agency in the United States government tasked with health and security. Even though the Ebola virus is far harder to catch or transmit than the new coronavirus, and it's easier to test for, since a test had already been developed, Ebola was its own harsh teacher. With the number of people infected doubling every 3 weeks at the epidemic's peak, there was a tremendous penalty for inaction. Either Ebola was contained early while it was still an away game, to use the parlance of counterterrorism, or it would quickly become a home game, threatening the security of the U.S. population and the global economy. U.S. President Barack Obama ordered a response for which the government had no playbook, a military mobilization of 2,800 troops who worked in support of tens of thousands of civilian health responders in Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. Together, the troops and civilians built thousands of beds in Ebola treatment units to isolate and care for those who were infected, supported contact tracing to limit the transmission, and led community education campaigns to show how Ebola is spread. The last major transmission change were stopped in late 2015, just over a year after the U.S. military deployed. Although Americans can be justifiably proud of their role in the nation played in a moment of global peril, the response to Ebola exposed gaps in preparedness and capability in every agency in the U.S. government tasked with health and security. The same was true for the international system. Shortfalls appeared in a bewildering array of places, from the U.S. Public Health Service not having enough yellow fever vaccines on hand to deploy personnel to West Africa, to the U.S. Africa Command not having an updated pandemic plan. At home, single Ebola cases swamped the public health and hazardous waste disposal systems of New York and Texas. Washington also presumed a degree of competence in the ability of the World Health Organization to respond to a major epidemic, a degree of competence that it turned out not to have. Once the magnitude of the crisis came into full view, and the United States and its partners rushed capability to West Africa, the failure to initially field adequate testing capacity and personal protective equipment to frontline medical personnel presaged the crisis now playing out with COVID-19. Now, even before the Ebola epidemic ended, the United States government began pursuing a three-pronged strategy to contain a more dangerous outbreak. First, it doubled down on the global health security agenda, an initiative the Obama administration launched before the Ebola crisis to expand capabilities around the world to prevent, detect, and rapidly respond to infectious disease threats. Through this initiative, the United States forged partnerships with over 60 countries around the world and used $1 billion of the Ebola response supplemental passed by Congress in December of 2014 to establish dozens of specialty labs around the world that can detect novel outbreaks and organize country-by-country programs to deepen preparedness. The strategy's second prong was to further build out the network of hospitals and testing centers in the United States designed to treat Ebola and to increase the size of the national medical stockpile with more of the protective personal equipment and materials needed to fight highly lethal pathogens. The third prong was to designate a health emergency response coordinator and to create a new directorate for global health security and biodefense within the National Security Council. It would be the job of this White House office to monitor biological threats and coordinate future responses. Crucially, this office would lead the post-Ebola reforms, using its perch in the White House to ensure structural changes within agencies and departments. Between 2017 and 2018, every prong of this strategy fell away like the wheels off a bus. Because combating a dangerous pathogen requires the close cooperation of parts of the government that don't ordinarily work together, increasing U.S. capacity would necessitate a willingness to direct changes that might go against the culture of federal departments, agencies, and the U.S. military. It would require cajoling Congress to increase budgets, add mandates, and adjust missions. And given the magnitude of these changes, it would require the personal leadership of the president. The seriousness of the threat of an infectious disease led the outgoing Obama National Security Team to include an influenza pandemic scenario in a joint exercise held with the incoming Trump team. To ensure that the new Global Health Security and Biodefense Directorate's mission would survive into the new administration intact, the outgoing White House team selected a career civil servant, a respected Pentagon biodefense expert named Elizabeth Cameron, to lead it, providing continuity from one administration to the next. As 2017 turned to 2018 and 2018 turned to 2019, every prong of this strategy fell away like the wheels off a bus. When the money provided by the Ebola response supplemental ran out, the new administration continued to fund the global health security agenda. But the overall budget for the Centers for Disease Control was cut, and no robust new investments were made in greater deployable capability in the United States or in other countries. At home, the envisioned expansion of the original 35-bed Ebola treatment network did not take place. The $25 million appropriated for the network in 2019 was not followed by a meaningful infusion of funds, setting it on track to expire in May 2020 and leading the Department of Health and Human Services to warn in November 2017 that the current capacity of this system is not likely to be sufficient for many types of infectious disease outbreaks, like pandemic influenza and other respiratory pathogens. Nor was the national medicine stockpile significantly bolstered. Congressional leaders passed budgets that had none of the vision or scale of the $5.4 billion Ebola response supplemental. The third prong of the strategy was the last to go. In his first month as National Security Advisor, John Bolton shuttered the new NSC Directorate for Global Health Security and Biodefense. Its leader departed the NSC staff just one day after the WHO declared a new outbreak of Ebola in the Democratic Republic of the Congo that to date has killed over 5,000 people. Historians looking back at the period between the Ebola and COVID-19 outbreaks will note a haunting series of events. The 2-year-old boy named Emile, who became the first known victim of Ebola in West Africa, died in the Guinean village of, Melindo in December 2013. 6 years later to the month, doctors in Wuhan Central Hospital noticed clusters of severe pneumonia that was unresponsive to treatment, a clinical development that evoked the SARS outbreak of 2002 to 2003. The NSC Ebola Lessons Learned report was completed almost exactly between these two events in the summer of 2016. Now, the focus must be looking forward, not back. Still, an accounting of the current outbreak and the U.S. response to it will be necessary, as it was after the Ebola crisis, so that lessons do not go unheeded yet again. Combating epidemics in the best of circumstances is hard. Even well-tested systems never perform as planned. It will never be known how much better prepared the nation and the world might have been for a coronavirus pandemic had the infrastructure called for by policymakers who fought Ebola been fully built. But the nation will ultimately have the sense of cost to lives and livelihoods of its absence. And that was Foreign Affairs. I am going to rest my voice.